Officials aren't giving anything away, but the question is, what will an attack look like? This ground offensive, where will it come from? What will it mean for all those impacted? Well, joining me once again from Tel Aviv to break this all down is the Times defence and political correspondent George Grylls. Thanks for joining us once again, George. You've been covering this story in quite some detail over the past few days. What are the difficulties at the moment when we consider this ground invasion and the supposed 220 hostages that are still there in Gaza?
That's right. I mean, if you see the release of 2 American hostages at the end of last week and then another 2 hostages late last night, there seems to be some progress in terms of diplomacy. And while there is hope and there is sort of diplomatic progress, it obviously sort of counters the argument that an offensive is necessary straight away to start freeing them. It must be said, this is only a handful. This is 4 hostages out of, I believe, around 222 that are now still being held captive in Gaza. So even though it's small progress, nevertheless, you might say that there might be nervousness in Israel about going in when there are tentative signs of small breakthroughs.
One of the compelling details that one of these hostages that was released revealed was about this network of tunnels that we know exists under Gaza, but described walking for kilometres along these wet hallways of this network of tunnels and then being kept there for the last 2 weeks. What do you know about how Hamas uses that network?
Well, I mean, it's been nicknamed the Gaza Metro, so extensive is the tunneling below the Gaza Strip. Israel alleges that aid money that went to the Gaza Strip was diverted and used into these huge construction and engineering projects to build this network. And Israel says that these are what Hamas uses to not only build weapons, but store weapons and even launch weapons from some places. And although they've almost stretched into decades now, tried to sort of clamp down on them, including tunnels that ran under the border into Israel, they obviously have only had limited success because the network is so huge.
It's astonishing to think about. And then in terms of on the ground, I mean, Gaza, one of the most densely populated places on earth. So it said, obviously, a few have tried to leave, not many can. The civilian casualty rates are already staggeringly high. What can possibly be done to limit further civilian casualties if the ground offensive goes ahead?
I think even before the ground offensive goes ahead, let's look at the aerial bombardment that's happening now. I know we tend to think of wars in terms of people on the ground, 2 trenches, but let's think about it in terms of missile strikes and what's happening in the air above us. Here in Tel Aviv, we have rocket attacks every day and you have sirens, but there is air defense. The Israelis do have Iron Dome and these sophisticated ways of shooting down incoming aerial attacks. In Gaza, that doesn't exist. And essentially, there is nothing to counter the aerial bombardment. If Israel chooses to strike something, there is nothing to stop that happening.
And tell us a little bit more about what you've experienced there on the ground today. You mentioned their rocket attacks. You mentioned that on a daily basis now as well. What are you seeing? What type of conversations are you having in your reporting?
I've just come back from an extremely upsetting and challenging trip to Shura, which is a military base just outside Tel Aviv. This is where there is a morgue set up where they are collecting the remains of people who died in the kibbutzim in the south, unfortunately, because a lot of the bodies were burnt, mutilated. There is quite a job underway of trying to identify the bodies and match them up with families who are missing loved ones and desperate to have any news. It's very hard to put into words how upsetting and horrible it is to just the smell of putrefying bodies when they open those morgues. It's something to behold, and it's overwhelming.
George, you prepare for this. Obviously, you're a defence and political correspondent, but nothing can prepare anybody for that level of atrocity and witnessing that firsthand. Obviously, the Israeli officials gathered 100 international journalists yesterday and showed them raw footage from the Hamas attacks on 7th of October. I don't know if you were among that 100, but you must know people who were as well. What did you think of that strategy in terms of making sure that the atrocity, the horror, was really conveyed and then conveyed to journalists who could then pass it on in words?
Well, my colleague was, yes, there. I was at this event at the morgue today. I mean, you kind of have to share it out because it's quite trying. It's quite yeah, draining having to go through that. But the Israelis are desperate to put forward their case and remind the world about what happens, because they feel that perhaps there are still sort of doubting corners about the scale of the atrocities, as terrible as it is to say, you know, and that's why, you know, we go to these events and look at these things that no one really should have to look at.
Absolutely, no one should. And as we have been hearing from a lot of our interviewees from Israel, there is this sense of never let it happen again. And this scale of the atrocity from the 7th of October attacks, you're seeing just things happening again that shouldn't happen in this world. In terms of precedent from other things you've seen in your career, of other types of atrocity, I mean, I can't imagine what it was like being there today at those kibbutzim. How do you think the world is going about then debating this, given that what is happening there on the ground, not only in Israel, but of course in Gaza as well?
Well, from Gaza, it's incredibly difficult. And this is one of the real challenges of reporting this, because access is basically impossible unless you were already there. That is why the perspective is certainly easier to show from an Israeli side, because you can get into Israel in a way that you can't from Gaza. And I can only imagine the absolute humanitarian crisis that's happening there and the horrors. And I am, like you, having to see it third hand through those reporters who are on the ground doing work in incredibly trying conditions, incredibly courageous about doing that work. So yeah, that is one of the frustrations of a conflict like this, is that you just cannot get in at the moment to Gaza.
Yeah, and you mentioned an important point there, the voices on the inside, and so many, you know, more than 10, I think just short of 20 Palestinian journalists have been killed in this conflict so far. Obviously, others have been killed from various different nationalities. A lot of journalists operating there at the moment. News has never been under the spotlight quite like it has in this conflict. What's it been like for you then, operating as a Western journalist there?
Yeah, you have to try and take your emotion out of it. You have to try and be as straight about what you see as possible. That's kind of what we aim to do, and that's why we go and watch this footage, or go to these morgues and see these things that you know, we'd rather not do. But it's important to try and bring some objectivity to it, because I'm sure plenty of people sort of following in on social media will feel the sort of emotional pull of this conflict. It's something has such fraught history, and our job, or what we try to do, is to take a step back and report everything as straight as we possibly can.
George Grylls, for the Times there, the defence and political correspondent, we really appreciate your time at the end of a very long day.